Well, hello, One Life Network, and all across all of our different sites. We're one church, many locations, and lots of chaos oftentimes. So I want to welcome you to our Religion Ruins Everything series. Now, this is born out of the idea that in the post 9/11 world, religion as a conversational topic, as a cultural reality, gets hit with things like religion causes violence, religion is anti-science and rationality, it's anti-progress, it's anti-pleasure. In other words, it's a cause of a lot of problems. Well, being a religious organization, we thought, it might be good to talk about these kinds of things. And our dream is to give anyone an opportunity to interact about the various issues that are raised. So last week, we started with this whole thing of religion causes violence. And I hope you'd go back if you weren't with us and take that in and listen to what we had to say about that. But I'm going to sum it up in 3 quick points. Here's what we said. First of all, does religion cause violence? The answer was yes. Because no one can deny that there's been religious convictions have motivated people to be violent. The 9/11 attacks were an example of that. Secondly, though, if you were to remove religion from society, though, would you get lots and lots and lots more peace? The evidence really doesn't say that. And the reason for that is because we said that the violence recipe simply has a lot more ingredients in it. It really, really does. I've told you the story before. I was beat up by the school bully named Billy Visser. Billy Visser when I was in 5th grade, and I'll never forget him getting me in a headlock and boom, just kind of going to work on my forehead. And I'm almost positive that Billy wasn't motivated by his religious convictions. You will become a Baptist. I was getting religion at the time, but for different reasons, right? So violence is caused by a lot of different things. Then finally, what we said was, if you were to look at Jesus' way of living and you say, this is the system of belief that he articulated and embodied, if you followed that, would it logically and necessarily lead to violence? And the answer was easy. It was categorically, absolutely no. Now, here's the catch, though. It has, right? It still has. And the example of that is that I hear most often come up in conversation in movies and television shows and things I read is the Crusades and the Inquisition. That's what a lot of people say. They're kind of put together. I even heard where President Obama was doing a prayer breakfast thing, and he said it that way. He was talking, Christians, we really need to think about the fact of the Crusades and the Inquisition. I told you the story last week. There's a Christian hip hop artist that for 20 years have been touring, doing Christian music and stuff. Last December, he jettisoned his faith publicly, and he said in his Facebook statement, he mentioned one of the reasons was the Crusades and the Inquisition, Crusades and the Inquisition. So at that point, I'm like, okay, we need to deal with this. Now, we're not gonna deal with both of those things today. Maybe we'll do the Inquisition at some other time, but we are going to deal with the Crusades because it does come up a lot and it is an example of Christian violence, right? So how do you deal with that? And the very first thing I wanna say, and what I wanna do is just kind of give us some guidance system stuff. Because I want to say up front is that, first of all, the Crusades were extremely complex things. Centuries of battles and different motivations and different rulers and different armies doing different things. It's a very, very complex topic. But what I want to do is kind of approach it from, if you're assessing Christianity, or as a Christian, you're just kind of wondering about it, how should you process that and how should you use it to assess Christianity? The first point I want to give you is this. As you're assessing Christianity through the grid of the Crusades, show authentegrity with your knowledge level. Show authentegrity with your knowledge level. Now, authentegrity is a word that was actually, I think, invented by one-lifers. We had a group of us, before we ever opened our doors, we gathered up and we said, what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of church do we want to be? And we wanted to be authentic and show integrity. In other words, we wanted to be transparent. We wanted to be the real deal, right? Well, I would encourage us, because of what the Crusades are, to show authentegrity with our knowledge level. Now, here's what I mean by that. And I'll go first. I decided, okay, I got to cover the Crusades. We got to talk about the Crusades. And as soon as I thought that and I started going that direction, I recognized I know almost nothing about them, okay? In other words, if there were a professor that put together 100 question test on the Crusades, I really think, well, depending on if it was true or false or multiple choice or something like that, I would probably get about an 18, something like that. I recognized about myself as I was looking at these things, I just have images in my head of what the Crusades are. And we got a few pictures that kind of illustrate this. First of all, there's a sort of a black and white image of guys standing there and sort of that Robin Hood-ish looking stuff, with the crosses on their chest, doing battle things. That was one image. Another image is, I saw the movie Kingdom of Heaven, starring Orlando Bloom. I did. I thought about that one. And then, another image in my head whenever people mention the Crusades is Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail. And so the Crusades, weren't they that thing where there was a killer rabbit? And what's ironic about that is that's not even what that movie was about. It wasn't really the Crusades. The point being is, I get a lot of pop culture stuff there rolling around. I have a very vague sense that something happened back there where people in those outfits and bad things happen. No denying that, bad things happen. But beyond that, didn't really know. Now here's what you got to know about me. I'm a history geek. I am. For entertainment, I love to read history. A great vacation for me would be to watch documentaries about history and read history books. I love this stuff. I'm a history geek through and through. And I have to admit, I didn't know that much about them. Now that I've come clean and trying to be authentegrity here and show some authentegrity anyway, where are you? How do you think you do on the test? Now, and I'm not calling everybody dumb, all right? But I know people well enough. I'm a history geek, so I probably have a little bit of an advantage over a lot of people. I would think across our 2,000 at One Life Network, a lot of us would get about an average of 18 or less. We just don't know that much about it, or we have a lot of pop culture images. Now, that's not to dismiss the fact that probably some of you would get 100 and get all the bonus questions right. The point being, though, is this. We can dismiss Christianity and the Christian message because of something we truly just don't know a whole lot about. So what I decided to do was I decided I needed to do a crash course on it. So I put myself through, I've read all kinds of articles and I looked at different books and things and just kind of tried to get my score up to at least like a 40 or something like that. And what I found was, there was one guy in particular that I was very interested in. He wrote a book called A Concise History. I like that, Concise History of the Crusades. It was still like huge. But he wrote a book, and in one of the articles that he wrote, he said one of the frustrations for himself as a scholar about the Crusades, and he's one of those foremost authority types, he said one of the greatest frustrations that they have is the gap in the public's knowledge versus the actual history that they know about and they've come to recognize. And so we have to be aware of that. So I sent myself into the crash course on this deal. And here's one of the conclusions I reached about it all. And I want to share this with you first. Okay, I've done this illustration a lot of times around here because I like it. I think it's helpful. And believe it or not, I drew this myself. It's scales, okay? We've used this a number of times because we've told you before, we want to be the kind of environment where people who want to explore the Christian faith can come in and hopefully with some intelligence and investigation really process through these issues. And so the scales is designed to kind of help people understand how belief and doubt work together, okay? Now, I'm going to call this belief and this is doubt. I would maintain in our hearts and minds, the reason we believe or doubt is because one side outweighs the other. In other words, I believe Christianity for lots and lots of reasons. I have a lot of weight on this side. Personal experience, my knowledge of maybe science or history or archaeology, relationships, all those factors go in and they add up on this side. Now, what I like about the illustration, why I use it so much, is because on this side, it doesn't mean that it's empty over there. In other words, I believe because my belief stuff outweighs the doubt side, but the doubts aren't completely gone. And those who doubt and who don't believe, it's kind of this side outweighs the other, and they probably have belief categories over here. And let me just say this right up front about this whole Crusades thing, honest thing. After going through my crash course, and my limited knowledge admittedly, but after going through my crash course on it, I would say this. I don't think that the Crusades as a subject deserves to be a large weight on this side. I'm not saying it shouldn't be a weight at all, But I think a lot of people treat it in their minds as like a 100-pound weight. And after looking at it and processing it, and I'll share some of these reasons why with you as we travel here, I really think it deserves to be more like a 10-pound weight or less. A 10-pound weight. Now, see, because I've had to conduct funeral services for little children. That's what I would call a 100-pound weight on this side. It is. The Crusades aren't quite that level. And hopefully I can kind of make the case for why I think that is. So that's the first thing. If you want to process the Christian message through the grid of the Crusades, show authentegrity with your knowledge level. That's the first thing. Second thing, when you're looking at these kinds of issues, history, and you're assessing Christianity through the grid of, or any philosophy, any religion, look at founders, foundations, and followers in that order. Look at founders, foundations, and followers in that order. Now, what do I mean by that? All systems of thought, whether they're religious or non-religious, like communism is a system of thought and a belief system. Hinduism is, Buddhism is, Islam is, Christianity is. They all make different claims and they're all different worldviews. They're different ways of looking at reality. A lot of them have founders. Communism did. If you really want to understand, go back to the founders. Look at Marx and Engels, and then look at the foundations right after that, and then look at followers. Do that with Islam. Do that with Christianity. And as you're processing stuff with like the Crusades, look at it through starting with the founder, Jesus, the foundations laid in the first century of the church, and then look at the followers' reactions through history. And that's what we're going to be doing. Now, I say that, just kind of keep your eye on that, because when it comes to the Crusades, when I went through my crash course and I tried to look at this, doing the founders and foundations followers deal, how I would sum up the problem and the struggle with the Crusades would come down to one basic issue in my mind, and I'm probably making it a lot simpler than it really is, but this is for conversation's sake, right? Is that it came down to the relationship of government and church. Government and church. A lot of the complexities, problems, troubles, and everything else, I would boil down that way. You see, the early Christians had a way of looking at this, and this is kind of how they looked at it. The church was one thing, the government was another. Now let's watch how this unfolds as we look at the founder and the foundations. In the New Testament, in the book of John, Jesus is talking to a government official who could have him executed, and actually does in the end. His name's Pilate, and he says this. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I love this response because I've never quite understood it, but I think it's intriguing. "Is that your own idea," Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, now catch this line. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You're a king then." "Ha," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world was to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews and gathered there and said, "I have no basis of a charge against him." Now, what I want to get to, there's lots of stuff in there. But I want to get you to see, first of all, the founder of Christianity, what he said about the relationship of world governments versus him in the church. And he obviously paints a different picture. He's saying to this guy, he's saying, listen, I am a king, yeah, but my kingdom is not of this world. It doesn't function on empires and armies and all the kind of thing that you're used to. Now, foundations. Foundations are what I would say are early writings that surround the founder and were kind of expressed by early followers. In a book of the Bible called Romans, the writer, Paul, he's coaching early Christians about their relationship with human government. It says this, listen, in Romans chapter 13, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities." For there is no authority except what God has established. Now, the authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear from the one in authority? Then do what's right, and you'll be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants and agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Okay, so taking Jesus and taking this statement, let's go back to this. The basic outline of early Christianity and where it was founded on this relationship was that government, notice, it's this separate thing. It's all under God. God's up here, and he gives them an assignment. The first one, the government, it says sword. I'm going to say that's army, that's law, and that is punishment and reward. That's what governments are supposed to do. That's why I've gotten so many speeding tickets, okay? The government's an agent of God's wrath to punish whenever you do wrong things, right? Because I'm endangering other people and myself. Theoretically, okay. So that's what the government does. The role of the church is wholesale different. It can influence the government. Christians can be inside the government, work for the government. They're supposed to pray for the government. And they have kind of this back and forth relationship, but they have different roles. Now, why am I going into all that? Because it's very, very important to understand, again, getting to the crusade thing here, it's very important to understand that the early Christians had this going on, and for nearly 300 years, it functioned that way. The government, the Roman government, did a bunch of stuff, and they were the armies, they did all this. The church, however, truly was a very, very peaceful thing. Its power, it viewed its own power and its ability to spread was completely through peaceful means, through the message. There might have been some Christians who did violent stuff, but the church spread by message. It spread by community. Churches sprang up all over the ancient world. It was actually a revolution, and it was truly a nonviolent revolution. It really, really was for nearly 300 years. Now, guys, get that in perspective. The United States of America is only 240 years old. That's a lot of history. So the early Christian movement for centuries was a peaceful, nonviolent thing, and in its relationship with the government. Now, about 300 years, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. Keeping that in mind, what happened was the government and the church, they were kind of existing together. The government used to persecute the church in the Roman thing. Over the 300-year period, sometimes the government would get mad at the Christians and decide they didn't like them. They would throw them to lions. They would burn them alive. They would pull them limb from limb, did horrible things. So in early 300s, a man by the name of Constantine becomes emperor of Rome. And he becomes the first guy, the first emperor to self-describe as a Christian. And that changed everything. And what it did was, and it was wonderful, and the Christians loved it because what it meant for them was they weren't going to be persecuted anymore. He signed an edict early on in his reign called the Edict of Milan. And the Edict of Milan was where it made it official. We're not going to do this official persecution of Christians anymore. As a matter of fact, we're not going to do official persecutions of any religion anymore. But here's what happened. And I have to figure out a way to get my pen over here. Okay. Here's what happened when that happened. Government and church kind of got blended together. Now again, early on, the Christians thought that was wonderful. But what you find over the next 1,000 years in European history is that this kept increasing. Over and over and over again, it kept growing to the point where, and I really do think that Christianity was kind of a victim of its own success, the lines between government and church started getting blurred to the point where in European history, the government was the church and the church was the government, and they both were together. And it wasn't really intended to be that way. Now, here's why that's important when it comes to Crusades. You have to understand that when armies marched, they were called Christian because all this stuff went together. It'd be the same as if nations who march now, the United States of America or anybody else, were to march, if they fly under the name of Christian, what they do is interpreted as a Christian thing. Now, more on that later. Okay. About 300 years after Constantine, a guy named Muhammad is born in the Arabian Peninsula. He founds the religion of Islam. Look at founders, then foundations. His perspective on that whole religion and government thing, they don't do churches, went like this. And this is, and it's going to sound like I'm trying to make Islam look bad. I'm really not. I'm just kind of giving you the facts of how it functions. Islam functions on, here's the government, here's religion, and they are designed from the very, very start to be the same thing. That's why to this day, you have the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Islamic Republics, because they don't see a separation between government. They became an empire. And from the very, very beginning, starting with Muhammad, starting with his immediate successors after he died, he had a government empire that did what? That they did law, they did armies, and they did punishments and rewards. That's what that says, never mind. Okay, punishments and rewards. And they immediately and very quickly, probably more quickly than any other, armies that ever marched, they expanded Islam and it became an empire. Now, in their defense, that's how empires started all over the world. The Romans did it, the Assyrians did it, the Babylonians did it. They marshaled armies, they went and took over land, and they really did. Now, with that in mind, just keeping that in mind, that's how it went back to foundations and things. The final thing I would kind of pass along your way, if we have that in our heads of how the history went, if you're processing the Christian message through the grid of the Crusades, keep this in mind. Have humility on the human side. Have humility on the human side. Now, with everything that we've said up until now, keep that in mind. I want you to imagine we go back in a time machine. All right, we got our DeLorean, we're going back in the time machine. We would go to the year 1095 in France. And we would gather around with a bunch of other knights and lords and people and peasants and all kinds of people in a city where Pope Urban II gives a speech, all right? And he launches the very first crusade, the whole movement, where it started. Again, it was about 1,000 years later. And here's what was going on, though. Here's what you would hear, and here's what potential crusaders heard originally. First of all, they heard that the Turks, is how we would say it, an Islamic Republic of the Turks, had been invading and were invading a place called the Byzantine Empire, all right? Well, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire called the Pope on the phone, basically, and said, hey, I've got an invading army coming my way of Turks. Would you please help? It'd be the same as if like Turkey or some kind of place like that called the United States. So Urban stands up and he says, our friends, this country needs our help, right? The second thing he said was, the Muslims, the Turks have owned the Holy Land. And for people back then, pilgrimages to where Jesus had walked and talked and done his miracles and things was a big deal. Now, I've done it myself, and it's a pretty big deal. It's neat to be able to go to the Holy Land. And they had closed that off. But then thirdly, he said, these Turks are committing atrocities. And he went into vivid detail. They said they would, with men, women, and children, they would cut them open and let their intestines spilled out. Sometimes they would nail them to things where their intestines were, and they would have them walk their intestines out. Just atrocities, right? And they said when they were hearing this speech, grown men were crying. And Pope Urban says, you've got to go help the weak. You've got to defend people from these atrocities. And that was their mentality and motivation. Now, in the original thing, we have this idea that they were called, you go down there and you convert those Muslims and you hold a knife to their throat and say, convert or else. And I'm sure that kind of thing went down later. Again, this is centuries. There were 8 different crusades, right? But in the original, if you were a crusader, you were motivated by those 3 things. It wasn't about land. It wasn't about forced conversions. It was about helping another empire, opening up the Holy Land, and helping people who were undergoing these atrocities, right? That's why they did it. So that's why I say, show humility on the human side. Because guys, and this, again, I'm just going to give you something to talk about, converse about. Because the more I read about the Crusades, and again, that's just one crusade. There were 8, and they were over 3-4 centuries, lots of different battles, lots of different motives, lots of different things. One of the things that I recognized, a lot of it sounded kind of familiar. Here's what I mean by that. Do you know which modern president got the highest approval rating of any modern president? You know who it was? Believe it or not, it was George W. Bush. He hit a 90% approval rating, if you could believe that, knowing kind of how things went. You know why? Because he gave a speech 2 weeks after 9/11 where he was talking about fighting terrorism, and he talked about going into Afghanistan. And 90% of the people in the United States approved of the job he's in, and off we went, and we marched to the war on terror. We were motivated, why? Because of atrocities that we had experienced. I find it interesting right now, during our current election, we have the ISIS issue over in Syria, and all these things are going on, and we've seen atrocities on the television, and some have been motivated. Yes, we need to go over there and defend against this. The reason I say have humility on the human side is because when it comes to wars and things like that, we're motivated by a lot of the same kinds of things. Now, where it gets complex is, and that's why this government stuff is so important, it's because if you lived in Europe, you lived in a Christian nation. Now, we saw from the founder and we saw from the foundations, there really wasn't ever meant to be a so-called Christian nation. There's Christianized nations, but there was never meant to be a Christian nation, and some of that got mixed up. So anytime Western Europe did anything, governors did that stuff, it turns into interpreted as Christian action. And I think we know by experience that's not necessarily always true. I've told you, one of the coolest experiences I ever had was teaching English in Afghanistan. For a month, I got to teach an advanced English class to Afghan nationals, college students. And after like the first teaching I did, one of my students approaches me and he comes to me and he says, "Why are Christians so immoral?" I was like, well, he didn't know I was a pastor. He didn't know anything about me. He said, "Why are Christians so immoral?" I'm like, well, why do you ask that? He said, well, you're a Christian, right? I said, well, yeah. But he was saying that, you know why he said it? Because in his mind, Americans are Christians, period. That's the flag they fly under. Because a Muslim doesn't make the division between government or any of that. If you live in the country, that they perceive us as Christians. So he thought I would have. Now, what was he asking? They love American movies over there. And he was saying that they love to watch them, but they see a lot of immorality. And so he asked, why are Christians so immoral? Because he sees all the sexual stuff, even though he's watching the movies. I thought that was kind of ironic. And my response was, okay, here, when I drive around in Afghanistan, my understanding is Islam teaches you to pray 5 times a day, right? And he said, yeah. And they actually have loudspeakers where prayers will come up 5 times a day. And what you're supposed to do if you're a Muslim is you're supposed to bow down and you're supposed to pray towards Mecca 5 times a day. And I said, I've noticed though that when I'm driving down the street and they're very crowded, when the prayers start, I can notice maybe 2 people in a crowd bowing down and doing the prayers. Everybody else is kind of walking around and doing stuff. I said, is that true? He said, yeah. I said, would you say there's a difference between a practicing Muslim and just one who's a Muslim by culture, and he just happens to live in a Muslim country? He said, oh yeah. I said, how many people out there do you think are actual practicing Muslims? Is it like 50%? He said, oh no, it's lower than that. Really? I think I got him down to like 20%. This was just him commenting. Here's the point. the Crusades, when you judge them as kind of this overall movement, they happened out of Christian Europe, and they were governments marshaling armies because that's what governments do. But there were individuals who were real Christians who wanted to do good, just like some of our soldiers in the army. I think some of our soldiers are motivated very much by their Christian convictions. They want to defend against atrocities and do that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, just because they say Christian on the label doesn't mean they're actual practicing Christians. So what you have all kinds of different actions. There were some heinous things done by the Crusaders. There were some noble things done by the Crusaders. Some of the Crusaders were genuinely motivated by their love for God, and they sacrificed greatly to do that because in their own minds, they were doing something noble. Others went along and kind of, wanted to gain land. In other words, it's a blend, just like it is now. What I determined after my crash course and with my admittedly limited knowledge was to dismiss Christianity because of the Crusades would be the equivalent of dismissing democracy and the Constitution of the United States because the United States has fought wars. There's like a logical connection. And notice about our wars over 2 centuries. I've noticed that the public has been for some of them and not so much for others. Sometimes we feel very justified. Remember when we went into Afghanistan, George Bush was like 90%. You watch a graph, if you watch his approval ratings after Afghanistan, it goes bleh, like that. Why? Because he went into Iraq, and that was a completely different thing, right? In many ways, it was the exact same way with the Crusades. You had the problem of cultural Christianity versus actual Christianity, political Christianity and movements, and personal movements. But because of all that and all the complexities involved with that kind of thing, that's what I would call for humility. I would sum it up this way. To dismiss Christianity because of the Crusades would mean to lack an in-depth understanding of the Crusades and to lack an in-depth understanding of Christianity. And my encouragement to everybody would be to pursue both. And let's continue the conversation as we search these things out. Here's how I'd like to close with this. The Crusades did have the complexity and the problem with that joining of church and government. Going all the way back to the founding of Christianity. This is something we've done in here before. But one of the things the early Christian leaders said to the people when it comes to government, one relationship we have with them is to pray for them. And we read this verse. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and I want to read it to you again because I want us to do this because it's so critically important because we've seen that if you get that complexity too much in there, it can cause some genuine problems. Paul coaches the church. He says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority. That, and here's his reasoning, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. We live in a complex world. We live in a violent world. We live in a world where armies do have to exist, but their main purpose is to be there to protect the peace, to protect you and I so we can hear the message, we can live out lives of peaceful and godly behavior. That's kind of the goal. So what I want us to do across all of our sites, wherever you are, bow your heads, close your eyes, and I'm going to lead us in a prayer for our government and our leaders, and I'm going to hand it off to our campus pastors to continue to pray for you guys as we seek out answers on these challenges. Let's pray. Father, in Jesus' name, we come before you and thank you for the founding of Christianity. Thank you for the founder of Christianity, and I pray that most of all of us will get to know him better, his life, his death, his teachings, his resurrection, everything, and help us to live it that way. But Lord, you've called us, one expression is, to spread the message peacefully, but then to pray for our government leaders. And so we do. We ask that you'll give wisdom to those in Washington, to those locally, that they can make decisions that will lead to peace, that will lead to godly lives. And we pray that for the world around. There's a lot of conflict places right now, and we ask for peace. We ask for wisdom for government leaders across the board. We love you, Lord. We thank you for who you are, and we ask you to do that in their lives and in our lives as well. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.